Welcome to another episode of The World Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very senior, accomplished, and respected professional from the world of academia from USA, Mr. Jim Detert. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Professor Detert is the John Colley Endowed Chair of Business at the Darden School, University of Virginia. He's a professor of public policy at the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. He's an author of several publications, but one of his books is Choosing Courage, The Everyday Guide to Being Brave at Work. And given his amazing background, he's been recognized, awarded, and felicitated several times. So, Jim, before we talk about leadership and organizational behavior, tell me a little bit about your own journey and what made you focus on leadership and organizational behavior.
It's an interesting thing. As I've gotten older, I've realized that I always thought that, and I felt bad about the fact that I didn't have one of these. I knew at 8 years old I was going to be stories, right? It's sort of the myth that that's what people have, and in truth, I didn't have that. I grew up in a very poor single mother with some health challenges household. And, in truth, I think now only, 50 years later, can I look back and say, what my childhood taught me is not that I knew exactly what I wanted to do or be, more so that I knew what I didn't want. I didn't want to be guided by authorities I didn't respect. I didn't want to be in what we might now, like in organization speak, we might say, I didn't want to be in a dysfunctional context or culture. So I knew what I didn't want. I wanted autonomy. I wanted freedom. I wanted to be able to control my own choices and thinking. And I think that, my journey has been much more of, at every step along the way, moving as much often away from what clearly wasn't going to work for me or be healthy for me as what was. And I think one thing that always was is I loved learning. My mom loved books. She took us to the library all the time. And so I think when I say, well, why did I land where I land? Why did I end up in academia? Why did I end up, caring deeply about whether people are led by functional, healthy leaders, people's psychology at work? It's very much, it's the root of sort of what I came from and what I didn't want to be or be around. Really has shaped my journey.
Well said. Well said. Thank you for sharing this. So let's talk a little bit about leadership and organizational behavior. And I also will have a few questions about your book. But let me ask you the first question. How do you define workplace courage? And why is it critical in today's business world?
Sure. So there's, of course, courage has been written about more or less as long as the written word in all cultures. I think it's helpful to think about a pretty simple definition of courage or workplace courage. I think of it as just doing something with some real or perceived risk for a worthy or noble reason or purpose. So really, I just focus on two elements. Are you doing something worthy despite it having some risks? And people can argue about other dimensions like how intentional or volitional or conscious. I actually think it just makes sense to say, are you doing something worthy despite risk? And, why is that critical in workplaces? Well, it almost goes without saying, right? It's critical because when you think of the physical problems and dangers that happen in workplaces, the problems to people's psychology and well-being, their health, the problems that organizations create for the world when they engage in bad behaviors. It takes people who are willing to risk at least two or three types of things. The economic or professional harm that could come from challenging power, people above you. The willingness to challenge the risk of social acceptance, being the person who sticks out as doing something different, disagreeing from the crowd, and psychological risk, right? We all tend to want to do things we feel good about and skilled at. And so when you say, hey, I'm going to innovate or take a stretch assignment, we risk looking stupid or being embarrassed or you're feeling uncomfortable. So, I mean, the work world, like other spheres of life, is filled with risks. where we need people to push past those risks because the outcomes are so vital.
Well said. And Jim, what in your view is the evolution of the concept of leadership in the digital age, particularly with remote work becoming so widespread?
Yeah, it's the question of the day, right? Widespread remote work, artificial intelligence coming on the scene.
Hmm.
I may be a bit of I don't think of myself as a Luddite, but I do think technologies and let's say cultural elements evolve very quickly, as we know. Human psychology, the human brain doesn't actually evolve that quickly, right? The human brain evolves over many generations.
Yeah.
So I think the truth is, I mean, if we take just, for example, work from home, what is that argument fundamentally about? It's about autonomy.
Correct.
People want autonomy. They want the right to decide where they work, which hours they work, in what mode of clothing and everything else they work. And we have known really since the start of the field of organizational behavior that autonomy is a fundamental human drive and motive. And so my take is that so much of what we get excited about calling new and flashy and the world changing thing, frankly, only reveals the same things at the core of human psychology we've known for a long time. So what's the work from home thing about? I think it's fundamentally about autonomy. It's about power and control. Who gets to decide how much autonomy workers have? Who gets to decide how to balance things like productivity and profit versus human well-being? How do you navigate the issues of humans' need for, on the one hand, autonomy, but on the other hand, need for belonging? It's harder for many people to sort of develop trust and belonging if they work from it. So I think the truth is, yes, there are elements that are different in terms of how one builds trust, how one balances these different core motives. But at some level, the challenges come back to the same things we've been studying and talking about for a long time, but really haven't mastered the lessons of.
Great response. Thank you. My next question is, what are the characteristics of a nonconformist leader and why are they vital for organizational success?
Yeah. Well, let's just start with why are they vital? I'm a strong believer in the quote by George Bernard Shaw. He said, the world demands conformity of us, right? But all change comes from nonconformists. So, the direct quote is that the world expects us to be reasonable, but all change comes from unreasonable people. So that's why it's vital. If we're going to change, not just sort of problems, that exist regularly in all organizations, but frankly, the fundamental way we deal with some of the existential threats to us, climate change, human mental and physical health problems. If we're going to address those, we're going to have to do something different. What we're doing is not working. So that's why we need nonconformist leaders. What do they look like in my experience? I guess I would just say two things. One, almost by definition, the nonconformist leader is not concerned about how popular they are on a daily basis.
Yeah.
They understand that leadership it's not high school. It cannot be a popularity contest anymore. It is about deeply in one's soul, knowing what you believe in and being willing to stand for it, even when it costs you something. The second thing I would say is, I think more and more, and I feel, deeply troubled about this, more and more, we have leaders who view, I don't think they would say this out loud. I don't know that they're conscious of it, but we have leaders whose behavior suggests all they think matters is the approval of people above them.
Right.
And I think part of being a great nonconformist leader is the willingness to say, I exist to be trusted by and serve those below me. And frankly, you can say, well, that's obvious. Of course, that's the right thing to do. It's also a nonconformist thing to do because sadly, in hierarchical organizations, most of the time, the way you get ahead, or at least most quickly get ahead, is you focus on the approval of your bosses and your boss's bosses. And what I'm saying is, truly great leadership would say, I'm okay angering them if it's to take care of, defend, promote, and support my people. And I think we just don't see enough of that today.
Well said. You know, I've often debated this with colleagues when I was running large companies. And I also said that you must have the ability or the power to say no to someone senior.
Yeah.
Would that be nonconformist?
Well, yes, if by ability you mean the willingness to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is, right, if your bosses say, oh, please do it, we love it, it's not nonconformist anymore. So, yes, if what you mean is the willingness to say, hey, I've heard what you said, I disagree, and here's why. Or, hey, I've heard what you said or watched what you did, I'm troubled by it, and here's why. Or it's not okay with me, and here's why. I think absolutely. And I started that reply the way I did because I think too often people think that being a great leader or not is well, I do it when given permission. But in my experience, sadly, around the world, right, most people who've held power, or whether it's concentrated wealth, political power, organizational power, they don't tend to wake up one day,
Right.
and then show up and say, I was thinking about it. I got too much power. So I've decided to disperse the power, right? Sadly, most of the time, the way power gets shared is those with less power stand up and say, you need to listen to us. You need to give us more of XYZ.
Great
And
response.
so, yeah, I think nonconformity is about saying,
well said. Well said. My next question for you, Jim, is what role does fear play in inhibiting leadership qualities?
well, in some respects, I guess the obvious answer is fear gets in the way of the kinds of things we're talking about, in the sense that, even if you're a leader, I mean, one of the myths, I see this in young people, I'm sure you've seen it in hundreds, thousands of young people, is they have this myth, this belief that, well, when I get to a certain level, then I'm going to ... right?
Yeah.
And what I say to them is, almost every human being in a hierarchical organization has one or more bosses. They say, well, no, I'm going to be the CEO. And I say, and then you'll have the board to report to. And so I think, we know, therefore, that this notion of I'm afraid to do X, Y, Z, right? Engage in these courageous behaviors, tell the truth to people above me, make a bold, innovative move. I mean, that's the obvious way in which fear gets in the way, is when people are afraid, they don't do the nonconformist they don't serve people below them instead of kissing upward. That's the obvious way. I would say the other way that fear gets in the way is, in a sense, it's a more insidious and possibly more damaging way. I think fear gets in the way when it affects at an unconscious level the way leaders react to everything. So you look at leaders around the world who show up as the most arrogant, the most full of themselves, the most confident. And what you often see is that bravado hides a deep insecurity, a deep fear.
Yeah.
And so when people walk around afraid, like with this unconscious feeling of threat always at hand, it orients how they, not just their own unwillingness, the obvious is the unwillingness to challenge, do their own challenging behaviors, but it orients how they behave toward everyone else. So a truly well-intended comment is still perceived as an attack. A suggestion truly designed to help the organization is perceived as, inappropriately speaking out of place against my power. When people are afraid at a deeply unconscious level, everything in the world shows up as a threat. And that's so damaging.
Well said. So I also wanted to get your perspective on ethics and leadership. And therefore, my question is, how can leaders balance the need for bold, courageous actions with the responsibility of ensuring ethical conduct?
Yeah. I mean, the simple answer, I guess, is that definitionally, I distinguish between, just pure risk taking from doing something risky for a worthy cause, right? So if you choose to go, bungee jump off a cliff or jump out of a plane or whatever, that's risky, but I don't know why we would call that courageous. I mean, we wouldn't call it leadership, right? It doesn't have a worthy purpose per se. So to me, one thing leaders have to be clear about, all of us have to be clear about, is when we do something bold or innovative, is it just risk taking?
Right.
And perhaps foolhardy risk taking. It's easier to be foolish with other people's money, for example. Or are we doing it for the right reasons, for a noble? Have we considered the harm that might be done to others? Have we really thought through the various stakeholders involved and what's likely to happen? So I think, one way to sort of just be bold while also being ethical is to just make sure you have really consciously thought through, like, what's the purpose? Why am I doing that? The other thing I would say, and this is about bold behavior, but it's really about any kind of decision making. A huge part of being ethical is simply the willingness to admit a lot of unethical behavior, perhaps the majority of unethical behavior, is sort of slipped into unconsciously by otherwise decent people.
Right.
And so if you can admit, I'm imperfect, I'm driven by self-interest like everybody else, I have blind spots like everybody else, then one way to be ethical while still, making important, bold decisions is to surround yourself with people who have different styles of decision making, different self-interests, different perspectives on the world, and then create the trust for them to really point out to you, hey, Jim, that's wrong. Jim, I think that's a problem. Jim, because I don't think any of us can individually ever claim we can self-monitor our ethical choices perfectly.
Correct.
So you have to create the environment around you where others notice and speak up.
Great response. And therefore, since you've spoken about decisions and ethics, I will want to ask you one more question on ethics, and that is, how can leaders effectively navigate ethical dilemmas that arise from conflicting shareholder interests?
Yeah, it's another, really important question. I think the simple thing, but often just incorrect thing to say, right, is, well, if you listen to what your stakeholders want, you won't make unethical decisions. But that's actually silly. I think Bill George, the former CEO of Medtronic, said this really well. He said, this is like saying, just focus on your shareholders because they're the owners. And he said, but as CEO, I would say, well, which shareholders? Do I focus on the 25-year-old investor who wants me to grow the company's worth over 50 years? Do I focus on the people in retirement who want the biggest dividend right now? Or do I focus on the short sellers who hope we don't do well? So he said, the reality is shareholders and stakeholders are a very complex array of human beings. So first of all, even knowing what they want is, in an aggregate, is a very hard thing to do. Second, the job of a leader is not to be a poll taker. Often when I work with groups, they say, well, I would poll my stakeholders. Then I say, well, then why should you be paid a leadership salary? We should just hire a low-level statistician to, collect the data and aggregate it. So it's not that either, right? I think ultimately what it comes down to, from my perspective, is good leadership decision-making is about appropriately getting input, appropriately thinking through stakeholder wants and needs, and then ultimately realizing that's one input combined with my values and the organization's values to arrive at a decision that I am willing to defend, even though I know not every stakeholder group will be perfectly satisfied.
Well said. Great response. So, Jim, we have time for two more questions. My next question is, how do global high technology and service-oriented industries differ in their approach to leadership and organizational behavior?
Do you mean how do tech firms versus?
Tech firms differ, tech firms versus service industries.
Well, some of the more obvious ones are, in many ways, right? The salary level, the education level, if you will, the investment made in people in tech firms is often much, much greater than in service firms, right? Especially if you're talking retail, etc. And so I think there is just a basic difference in whether people are seen as assets or expenses in these two types of firms, right? And sadly, so many of the problems we see, I think, in service firms, especially like lower paid service, are precisely the problems created by viewing them as interchangeable parts. I think, there are obviously lots of other, I think what you often see more of also in tech firms is the mistake of assuming that because someone has been a brilliant technical performer, they should be promoted into a leadership role. One of the things I think you see as a larger difference is in service firms, especially because the human element of interaction, trust, emotional intelligence is much greater. Often they promote people at least for the right reasons, those skill sets. What I think you see in tech often is, oh, you are the most brilliant coder, engineer, so let's make you the head of the engineering team. And of course, that's a completely separate skill set.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And my last question. Sorry, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think there are obviously differences. I mentioned one or two. And I'm completely open to the idea that I might be completely wrong. I personally, what I observe as I work with all different kinds of organizations is that at the root, because all organizations are populated by human beings, and human beings trying to gather together to achieve something, many of the problems are pretty similar.
Correct. And do you also think one difference is between high-tech and service-oriented businesses is that high-tech structures are flatter as compared to more hierarchical structures? But, that's just my own understanding. You are the expert.
Again, I mean, I think there are other people who really have studied these flatter organizational structures and could speak with more expertise than me. What I understand to be the case, let's say in the US at least, is that there's been a lot of disappointment actually around that. The hope 15 years ago, whatever, 20 years ago was, oh, Silicon Valley tech, they're not only going to, be these exciting new product companies, they are going to create a whole new way of organizing and working, right? And everybody was so excited about that. They said, oh, thank God, finally we're going to be done with some of these problematic elements of Wall Street banks or big old, bureaucratic forms of organizing. But 20 years later, what I essentially hear people say is, man, it turns out they created a lot of the same ugly problems.
Yes.
And in some cases worse because they're run by 20-somethings rather than 50-somethings. So, I have a friend at INSEAD. He did his PhD on Zappos, and holacracy. And I think that in the end, structure matters, right? I mean, if you have to go through 15 layers to tell somebody something, that's obviously a problem. On the other hand, humans, it seems, have a somehow almost inherent, an inherent tendency to form hierarchies of some type or another. And, there's, I think, evidence that we almost have an internalized, perhaps evolved sense of dominance and submission behaviors. And I think even were that not true, one of the problems with truly flat organizational structures is the world moves of organizational life moves so quickly and requires decisions that the idea that every single decision could be made in a completely consensual manner, taking as much time as necessary to get complete by, I don't think that actually works in the world of work. What I think we're probably learning as we've seen some flatter structures is there are some real benefits and there are some real challenges. And in the end, we still have to figure out the same human struggle between control and involvement.
Well said. Great response. And my last question to you, Jim, and I want to come back to your book. In your book, Choosing Courage, you outline strategies for being brave at work. Could you share a standout strategy with our viewers and listeners?
Sure. Let me start by saying I think you have to distinguish when you decide to be brave at work. What are you doing it for? What's your goal? So if your goal is simply to say, I'm going to take a stand for X, consequences be damned. Like, I care about this. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Then at some level, your strategies don't matter that much because you're willing to accept the consequence of what you said. What I would hope, though, is most of the time people say, I do care deeply about this issue, and I'd like to present it in a way that those with the ability to act can hear it, might actually do something about it. So, what I think is you need to find that intersection between you care about it and you can help others care about it because of how you say it. And so assuming that's your goal, I think, my book talks about, 50 or more specific tools, techniques, strategies, but I'll mention just kind of one concept given our limited time. And I'll just call that framing. The natural human tendency when we want to speak up, we want to promote something is we'll do what's, sort of logical in a sense, which is we frame it the way it's compelling to us. Like if I have this idea and I have an idea for the brand called You, for your podcast, and I want to tell you my idea. The logical starting point for me is I'm going to tell it to you the way it's compelling to me. It turns out, though, you are ultimately the person who has to be convinced if anything about the brand called You is going to change, right?
Right.
And so what people make the mistake all the time is they go in and they pitch something, they say something from their own perspective, forgetting that it's ultimately the other person who has to hear it and accept it. And so some common types of framing mistakes would be, if you're my boss and what you are fundamentally driven by is what's the bottom line here? How is this financially going to be good or bad for us? And I come in and frame it about, this is an idea that fits who we are and it's our culture and it fits our values. Yeah. Well, I might be compelled by values, but you might be more compelled by the bottom line.
Correct.
Similarly, if you only tend to act when you perceive something to be a threat, but I'm all driven by opportunities. So I come in and say, this is a great opportunity to change the brand called You. And you're like, well, what's wrong with the brand called You? It's doing just fine. I'm not going to connect. And so there are so many different frame contrasts like that, where our tendency is going to be to pitch ideas, present problems, whatever, from our frame. And that's very often a mistake because ultimately it's the decision maker's frame that determines whether you get something done or not.
Very well said. Well said. And on that note, Jim, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own amazing journey. Thank you for speaking to me at such length about leadership, about courage, about ethics, about structure. And finally, thank you for this one strategy from your book, Choosing Courage. I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Professor Jim Detert's book. And I'm going to do the same. But thank you for speaking to me and good luck to you.
Thank you so much and best to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.